Sure enough, something was bound to end up spoiling my lunch, and I was darn right about it. Just as I take a bite of my sandwich, the phone starts to blare in my ear. It was the museum. I guess someone had stolen a chunk of rock.
Something terrible has happened. A very valuable...
Deal with it! I yelled furiously.
But this is different. The most precious statue in the entire museum has been replaced by a fake.
Switch-A-Roo!
The first thing I had to do was interview the creator for any additional facts about the statue.
This isn't my statue! It's ugly, it's hideous, and it looks really bad! Like, the leg is falling off! It's a total fake!
Who do you think stole the statue?
The only people that could have gotten to this room were Mrs. Change, Mr. Sweep, and Mr. Beaker, because they're the only people that have night access to this room. I also sprinkled baking soda all over it to keep it clean. For some reason, it just works. The only way to make the fake is if someone had special equipment to remake it, which Mrs. Change conveniently has because of her science show.
When I walked through the door to interview Mr. Sweep, he was sleeping. More like Mr. Sleep.
Where? Hey, what?
I asked him if he was okay.
I have to keep the museum clean. I've worked here longer than anyone else. And I couldn't bear to see the museum be all dirty and ugly.
That convinced me that he was a good guy, but then I spotted a white powder substance all over his chair. Calmly, he told me that it was sugar from a donut. The only way to figure this out was to taste it. Yep, it was sugar. I also found some strange ring in his desk. Not sure what it was, though. I was pretty tired from all this running around, so I stopped over at Donuts O'Plenty to grab a bite. Beside the table, there was some sort of claw machine. The exact same ring that was in his bedroom was also in the claw machine, which tells me he must have gotten the donut here, which would explain why the white powder was in his office. Next, it was Mrs. Change's turn. She looked nervous. I know one thing about nervous people. Either they're scared or they have something to hide. I asked her about the statue and she started blabbing on about how it took people away from her science show. I knew she was not scared of me, but she had something to hide. Then, I saw the white blotch across her shirt. She stepped back quickly and blurted out, "That's from my science show!" Her story seemed far-fetched. I didn't believe her. I brought a sample of the powder home just to examine it. While making a salad, I accidentally dropped some vinegar. It rolled down the table, eventually hitting the white powder that was laying there. It exploded all over the room, making a sticky mess of white bubbles and foam everywhere. And I just Swiffered the whole place. It reminded me of that volcano project I did back in the 5th grade. What a mess. Before interviewing Mr. Beaker, I overheard two people talking about him. I heard Mr. Beaker was the worst person in the entire museum. Me too. I also heard that he was trying to find some way to get rich and famous. I wonder how he's gonna do it. I don't know. I went to Mr. Beaker's room to interview him, and there he was, staring at me just like Mrs. Change. His teeth were chattering, and he looked very, very nervous. The next thing I noticed was a lump in the wall. It had an odd shape. I also noticed the very same white powder that had been in Mrs. Change's room was in the office of Mr. Beaker. I reached down to touch it, but then he slapped my hand, knocking the powder all over the floor. I think I had enough information now. It was time to put all the pieces together. We all know that Mr. Sweep was not the culprit here. He was simply a donut addict. My conclusion was this. Mr. Beaker and Mrs. Change had to have been working together. Mrs. Change wanted the police to blame Mr. Beaker because he wanted to be rich. And while Mr. Beaker was being blamed and yelled at by the police, Mrs. Change would get all her people back to join her shows instead of watching that ugly little statue. The next day, Mr. Beaker confessed and gave back the statue.
I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you meddling adults!
But Mrs. Change was never seen again. Another case closed in the name of science.